Nobody ever thought the ship was going down.
They did not believe the ship was hurt in any way.
Again and again, it was repeated, this ship cannot sink.
There were a lot of ladies and gentlemen that were just treating it as a kind of a joke.
My husband joked with some of the women he knew, and I heard him say, "Don't you hear the band playing?"
The ship had a list on her port side.
She was taking a list over to port.
She listed to port.
The ship had quite a list to port.
The ship had a list to port.
The list to the port had been growing greater all the time.
The ship was then at a heavy list to port.
At the time she put the bridge underwater, was the list considerable?
Yes.
I did not notice her being much down by the head.
Do you mean that the list to port was more serious than being down by the head?
I thought so, yes.
She had a pretty heavy list to port.
There was a very palpable list to port, as if the ship was about to topple over.
At this time, it was almost impossible to walk on the deck without having caught hold of something owing to the ship heeling right over.
The officer called out all passengers to the starboard side.
The order was called, I think, by the chief officer. Everyone on the starboard side to straighten her up, which I repeated.
The captain was there, and he sung out, "Everyone over to the starboard side to keep the ship up as long as possible."
The port side was where she had listed over, and we went to the starboard side.
There were hundreds on the starboard side.
I remember somebody shouted, "Go gently," as if a sudden shift of weight would have disturbed the ship's position.
When the order was given to the passengers to go to the starboard side, I'm under the impression that a great many went over.
After she got to a certain angle, she exploded. There came a terrible explosion, and I could see men, women, and pieces of the ship blown into the air from the after deck, and I am sure more than 100 persons were blown off into the sea by that explosion.
There was a great number of people killed by the explosion.
The decks had blown up, with the pressure pulling the boat down, bow on, this heavy weight, and the air between the decks. That is my theory of the explosion. I think it was the pressure, that heavy weight shoving that down, the water rushing up, and the air coming between the decks. Something had to go.
I looked round and suddenly saw the ship part in the middle.
The two forward funnels seemed to lean, and then she seemed to break in half, as if cut with a knife.
We heard a terrible explosion, and as all of you know, the Titanic had 4 funnels, and when we heard this explosion, the Titanic broke in half. And that's when the people started jumping into the water and screaming. That's when they screamed. It was terrible. Screamed for the women, you know, and all.
The cry was blood-curdling, and never stopped until the Titanic went down. When the explosion occurred, the deck gave way in the middle, and the people standing there fell to the bottom of the hold. The sight that followed was too awful to put into words. Most of the steerage passengers were killed when the deck broke under. I do not believe they lived long enough after that fall to suffer a great deal. The cries of the steerage men and women came up from the hold, but only for a moment. It seemed to me that she broke in two just in front of the third funnel.
She broke clean in two.
I am confident that the Titanic broke in two, and that was why she sank.
In my opinion, the ship, when it went down, was broken in two.
She exploded, broke in halves. You could see the explosions by the smoke, coming right up the funnels. It was all black, looked like as if it was lumps of coal, pretty big lumps. Just after the explosion, through the funnels, steam, and very black smoke.
When the ship was sinking, a volume of smoke came up.
After the noise, I saw a huge column of black smoke, slightly lighter than the sky, rising high into the sky, and then flattening out at the top, like a mushroom. Suddenly, the whole superstructure of the ship appeared to split, well forward to midship, and bow or buckle, upwards.
I reached a collapsible boat that was fastened to the deck. The Titanic gave a lurch downward, and we were in the water, up to our hips. She rose again slightly, and I succeeded in cutting the second rope.
We heard a fearful explosion. I saw the ship split open. At the same time, the ship's bow rose up in the air, as the steamer sank towards the center.
Suddenly her nose, on which I was, seemed to suddenly rise from underneath the water.
She exploded in the water. Her stern end was up, out of the water. It blew her stern up.
I saw the waters reach the bridge, after the vessel broke in two, and the forward portion began sinking first.
The ship seemed to be heaving tremendous sighs as she went down.
The ship was shaking very much, part of it being underwater.
The ship took a dive, reeling for a moment, then plunging.
Then she suddenly took a top cant. Her stern came well out of the water then. The mass of people on board were surging back, always back, toward the floating stern. Their idea was to get onto the poop. All the passengers climbed up. She was white, around there, and it looked like a big crowd of people.
The ship started breaking up, and her stern went up in the air, and you could see her 3 propellers.
The forward funnel broke from the ship, falling on the starboard side, into the sea. Her stern was well out of the water.
I could distinctly see the propellers, everything, out of the water.
The second funnel seemed to be lifted off, emitting a cloud of sparks. Her deck was turned slightly toward us. We could see groups of the almost 1,500 people aboard, clinging in clusters or bunches, like swarming bees, only to fall in masses, pairs or singly, as the great part of the ship, 250 feet of it, rose into the sky.
I heard a second explosion.
How far apart in time were the 2 explosions?
From 8 to 10 minutes.
I heard 2 explosions.
I can remember 2 explosions.
There were 2 reports or explosions.
I heard 2 sharp explosions in the ship. The screaming and the hissing kept up, and finally the ship seemed to right itself.
The afterpart righted itself.
She gave a great list, over to port, and threw everybody in a bunch. She threw them over. I clambered on the side when she chucked them. Many hundreds, I should say.
The afterpart floated back.
The funnel seemed to cant up towards me. It seemed to fall up this way.
When she broke off, her stern end came up in the air, and came down on a level keel.
The afterpart settled down again, and we thought the afterpart would float altogether.
The afterpart righted itself again, and the forepart had disappeared.
Her poop righted itself, and I thought to myself, the poop is going to float.
It uprighted itself, as if nothing had happened.
You said this vessel took a lurch to port, and threw them in a heap. Did she come back? Did she right herself, at all?
No.
She took a lurch, and she did not return.
She did not return. I eventually got onto the starboard side of the poop, on the side of the ship. The lights were still on, in the after end of the ship, after the first and second explosions.
When she came back like that, on a level keel, Were there any lights?
Right aft. The lights were right aft. What were burning on the after and what was floating?
Did they continue burning right away aft to the taffrail?
Yes, right aft.
The lights had gone out in the fore part of the ship then. The lights were burning in the after part of the ship. It was only the after section that was burning. The after part of the boat had her lights burning.
After she broke in two?
Until she went underwater, yes sir.
When that part went under the water, the lights were still on.
Did you notice whether the lights of this after part were still lighted, or not?
There were lights burning then.
Did you see any lights on the stern after she settled?
Yes sir, until she finally disappeared underneath the water.
After the break?
Yes sir.
We could see the after part afloat and there was no forepart to it.
How long was the stern afloat in that horizontal position?
About 4 or 5 minutes.
She uprighted herself for about 5 minutes.
The stern either pivoted around towards our boat or we were sucked towards it.
The ship had turned around.
She turned her deck away from us as though to hide from our sight the awful spectacle. She tilted slowly up, revolving apparently about a center of gravity. The stern then seemed to rise in the air and stopped at about an angle of 60 degrees. It seemed to hold there for a time.
The rumble and roar continued with even louder distinct wrenchings and tearings.
It was a noise no one had heard before, and no one wishes to hear again. It was stupefying, stupendous. It was as if all the heavy things one could think of had been thrown downstairs from the top of a house, smashing each other and the stairs and everything in the way. When the noise was over, the Titanic was still upright, like a column. We could see her now, only as the stern, and some 150 feet of her, stood outlined against the star-specked sky, looming black in the darkness, and in this position she continued for some minutes. She slid slowly forwards through the water, and dived slantingly down, and then with a hissing sound, it shot right down, out of sight, with people jumping from the stern,